Most of us know about leprosy from Father Damien and Molokai, but that's not what is meant here by leprosy. Leprosy was any kind of skin problem, any kind of open sore, any kind of blemish. All of that was leprosy. Basically, the problem with leprosy was, perhaps originally, was afraid it would be communicable disease. But basically what happened is the person got just thrown out of the community. The biggest loss was not health. The biggest loss was no longer had any relationships with anybody. You no longer could go to the synagogue. You no longer were considered part of the chosen people. Your own family you couldn't live with, and nobody could touch you without becoming ritually unclean themselves, which meant they could no longer go to the synagogue, and they could no longer consider themselves a part of the saved people. So they lived apart. Approached them, they had to warn them away. Unclean, unclean. So you're talking about a social outcast, more than a diseased person. And when Jesus heals him, he's not only restoring him to health and cleaning up his skin problems, he basically is restoring him to his family and restoring him to his community and recognizing his humanity and reaching out in love, as God does, to restore him to all those things. We've got lepers in our society too. They just don't have skin diseases. They're people we don't associate with. And we don't want anybody associating with them. We don't so much recognize them as being common in humanity with us, part of God's people. And they, by and large, don't get to church. And they don't belong to the groups we belong to. And there are a lot of those kind of people. People that are bullied in school. People that are taken advantage of in the workplace. People that are run over by government. All kinds of people that become less than human. They become something, untouchables. There was a story in the papers in 2008. And there was a football game, a high school football game. And it was between Gainesville State and Grapevine Christian. Now, Grapevine Christian was obviously private Christian school. Gainesville State was the maximum security prison for teenagers. It housed 285 of them. And they had a football game. Gainesville State lost the game. They'd played 9 games that year and lost all. But that game was different because Grapevine Christian divided up their audience, their group, and half of them sat on the side of Gainesville State and cheered for them. They divided up their cheerleaders. The juniors all went over and were the cheerleaders for Gainesville State. And they created this big line for the players to come out when they first came out of the tunnel. And so by the time they got back to Gainesville State, these so-called untouchables were different because they'd been treated differently, because their humanity had been recognized, because somebody had to do something different. Now, can you just imagine what parents thought about having their students go play in that football game? With whom? Who are you playing? What kind of security measure in place? I think the questions that would have been asked would have been questions about how are you going to respond as a Christian in this situation? How are you going to respond as a person of faith in this situation? We are the healers today. We are Christ in our midst. We are the ones who have to touch. Jesus became ritually unclean by touching, and Mark is very clear. He touched the leper. He didn't say from a distance, say, be clean. He went up and touched. Wasn't put off by the little prescriptions of the scribes, the Pharisees. In our world, what about the people that we encounter that are nobodies? Do we recognize the humanity of people that ordinarily we avoid, that we would want to be having them ring a bell and say, unclean, unclean? How do we as Christians respond to them? How do we recognize them? How do we touch them in a way that makes a difference? I keep going back to a friend of mine in Stockton who set up St. Mary's Interfaith Dining Room that I've been involved with since. One of the things he did is he planted flowers all over their center because he said the poor has as much right to beauty as anybody else. And he sat down every day at lunch and ate with the people that came for their meal, face to face. That's the challenge before us. We can live in our comfortable world, or we can be as Christ and reach out to those that are uncomfortable, those that are dismissed, those that are hurting, those that have messed up, those whose humanity is not recognized, appreciated, and that no one reaches out to touch them. We're coming on the season of Lent. Be a good way to go about Lent. Who do we need to touch? And how do we do it? The way Christ would do it.